I gotta give the students from Greenville a lot of credit because I'm normally the one messing with people. This is an indication that I'm getting old. You guys are turning the tables on me. I initially, this was totally unplanned. I thought I was getting punked, and then I actually opened the proposal. It's extremely well thought out. They've got a lot of stats in here. I think they put a lot of time into it. It's a legitimate proposal. I will take it under consideration and review it. So thank you, Joe, for the kind words, and also thank you, Sam Beard and Hillary and the Jefferson Awards. And I couldn't get up here without thanking my supremely tolerant wife, Alexandra, who puts up with an unbelievable travel schedule that I'm not entirely sure she knew she was signing up for. I've been, all of us have been touched by cancer in some way, either in our immediate family, our friends, ourselves, and 1/2 of men and 1/3 of women will get cancer in their lifetime. 8 million people die of cancer every year. And we've met this challenge with enormous resources. Some would say adequate resources, and as much as $300 billion in largely public funding over the last 4 years on research and development. And despite a lot of early progress, 50% of cancers are now readily treatable if you catch them early enough. Somehow, patient outcomes over the last several decades have barely improved. So death rates have decreased by only 2% between 2003 and 2012. And for many cancers, the 5-year survival rates are barely better now than they were in 1990. The closer I got to this field, the more time I spent in it, the more I began to wonder, how is this even possible? How is it that we can spend such an extraordinary amount of money? And if you look at the global figures, you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars a year just in research and development. And yet, the progress has been relatively slow. Now, the best way to understand, I think, why things have gone systematically wrong in this field, and I mean that despite all of the best efforts by researchers, scientists, patient advocacy groups, patients, families, doctors, there has been an enormous concerted effort to confront this problem, and yet the problem is not really a resource problem, it's a resource allocation problem. It's a problem of where these resources are being directed, how they're being directed, and the ability or the need to take really big creative bets rather than pursuing incrementalism. So the best way to understand, I think, what has gone wrong is to look at a recent case, a recent patient story, where I think things actually went really right. So I recently met a man, an amazing cancer survivor in his early 90s. He's extremely active in his community to this day. He's from a small southern town. He leads Sunday school at his church. He was diagnosed with metastatic melanoma that had spread to his liver and his brain. On August 12th, he announced to the world, his family, his friends, and this was 2015, that he's at peace with what's happening, that he's making his preparations. I think he said specifically that he's at ease with whatever comes as he enters this final stage in his life. But as a last-ditch effort, he decides to try a new treatment modality called cancer immunotherapy or cancer immunology, specifically a drug called Keytruda that unleashes the body's own immune system so that it can recognize and destroy tumors. 4 months later, in December 2015, standing in front of his Sunday school in Plains, Georgia, he announces that his cancer is in remission. His name is President Jimmy Carter. I am that much more privileged to be standing here tonight because some years ago he received this very same award that I'm receiving tonight, which is just extraordinary to think about. So for decades we put all of our research dollars and energy into chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery. And these therapies have worked, as I said, for half of cancers. The other half, unfortunately, remained a death sentence. And the bulk of all funding was going to these modalities. They're modalities that work while you're giving them. They work while you're cutting the cancer out, while you're radiating the cancer, or while you're administering chemotherapy, but they don't tend to produce durable long-term remissions. And it's pretty extraordinary, actually, how little funding was going to cancer immunology. This is why this is such a powerful case. Less than 1% of funding was going to cancer immunology over the last decade. $5 billion a year now in NCI funding coming from the government, and less than 1% of that was going to cancer immunology. This is largely because scientists, the same scientists that get funded from one year tend to get funded the next, the same centers tend to get funded, and scientific research tend to favor the incremental safe bets rather than really revolutionary bets. And so despite this lack of funding in a field which by all accounts is actually relatively well funded, private donors stepped in, and several $100 million was all it took for some of the really important trials that led to now 3 FDA-approved drugs, and hopefully in the next several months, 2 more FDA-approved drugs, which are cell therapies, which have transformed the treatment of melanoma and blood cancers like leukemias, lymphomas. To the point where melanoma, which, stage 3, stage 4 melanoma was previously a death sentence in patients who had failed chemotherapy and other interventions, and it's now largely treatable due to cancer immunotherapy. So it's critical for us to question the existing models for medical research, and we also need to be a lot more aggressive in our funding. We need to place big bets. We need to let scientists do the work that they're most enthusiastic and passionate about, not necessarily the work that's easiest to fund. And we need to challenge the entire community to take these risks. We also need to try to help. We need to be very cognizant of the fact that most clinical trials in the U.S. don't even get enrolled. Less than 1% of people who are eligible for clinical trials ever enroll. It's really hard to do science when recruitment to clinical trials is so difficult. So there's a lot of work to be done. The good news is that over the last 5 years, immunotherapy has gone from being a relatively fringe area of science to one that is increasingly mainstream. It is an area that probably treated fewer than 1,000 people a few years ago, and is now treating several 100,000 people today. That's still a very small percentage of people who are diagnosed with cancer every year. And unfortunately, it's usually a treatment of last resort. And towards the end of life with cancer, after going through many rounds of chemotherapy, your immune system is relatively ablated. So we can only imagine how successful some of these treatments could be if they were given as first-line treatments rather than treatments of last resort. So there's a lot of... So there's a lot of work. There's been a lot still to be done. There's been an enormous amount of progress recently. But there's this incredible good news in immunotherapy, that the next line of treatments that are likely to be approved, which are engineered cell therapies. They're essentially T cells that are taken out of the patient's body, genetically modified, turned into cancer-killing Delta Force assassins, expanded into the billions, and then given back to the patient where they go to war with cancer. This is now working in 90+% response rate in ALL, 60+% response rate in CLL, and there are more indications coming. So the hope is that over the next several decades, technologies like immunotherapy, but also targeted therapies and next generation therapies that we can't even imagine today, will give millions of cancer patients the ability to know that cancer is not a death sentence, and the chance to announce at their Sunday schools and to their children and their families that they no longer need treatment because they too are cancer free.